The morning of April 14th, 1847, arrived at Bellamont House with the same oppressive heat that marked all Louisiana springs. The air hung thick and still over the cotton fields, carrying the scent of turned earth and the distant sound of field hands beginning their day's labor. In the main house, a structure of white-painted wood and tall columns that spoke of wealth accumulated through cotton speculation, the household slaves moved through their morning routines with the practiced silence of those who had learned that visibility invited trouble. Rose had been at Bellamont House for 4 days. She was 12 years old, recently purchased from the Mercier estate in Mississippi for $200, and she understood almost nothing of why she had been brought here. The journey from the only home she had ever known had taken 4 days in a wagon, chained alongside 3 other slaves being transporting to various properties in the region. Her mother, Dinah, had been left behind at Belle Reve, and the memory of their final moments together, her mother's whispered words, her desperate embrace, played endlessly in Rose's mind during the long nights in the unfamiliar quarters. She had been kept separate from the other house slaves initially, given a pallet in a small cabin she shared with 3 women who watched her with curiosity and something that looked like pity. They asked few questions. New slaves disrupted established hierarchies, and Rose's light complexion and careful selection by the master himself marked her as someone potentially dangerous to know. The other slaves at Bellamont went about their work with the efficiency born of fear and long practice, moving through the passages and rooms of the great house like shadows. Judith, an elderly woman who had worked at Bellamont House for 30 years and served as the informal leader among the house slaves, had pulled Rose aside on her second day. They were in the summer kitchen, a separate building behind the main house, where the heat of cooking would not make the main rooms unbearable during the hot months. Judith's hands never stopped moving as she spoke, kneading dough for the day's bread with the automatic motion of decades of repetition. "Child," Judith said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper though they were alone, "you need to understand where you are now. This house has its own rules, its own dangers. I do not know why Monsieur Laval brought you here, but I have seen enough in 30 years to know when something is not right." Rose had nodded, though she did not fully comprehend. She was 12 years old, torn from everything familiar, thrust into a household where the very air seemed charged with tensions she could not name. Her mother had taught her to be invisible, to keep her eyes down, to move quietly through spaces occupied by white people. These lessons had been drilled into her since she could walk, and they were all she had to guide her now. The master, Henry Laval, was a man of 51 years who had built his fortune through cotton trading and land speculation. He had arrived in Mississippi as a young man with modest means and considerable ambition, cultivating relationships with established planters while building his own wealth through careful investments and advantageous marriages. His wife, Celeste, came from an old New Orleans family whose name carried more weight than their diminished fortune. Their marriage had united Henry's new money with Celeste's old name, a transaction that benefited both parties in the complex social calculations of antebellum Louisiana. The plantation itself was prosperous by the standards of the region. 43 slaves worked the cotton fields under the supervision of an overseer named Thomas Garrett, a hard man who believed that productivity was maintained through constant discipline and the ever-present threat of the whip. The house slaves, 12 in total, maintained the domestic operations under Celeste's direct supervision. She ran her household with exacting standards, demanding perfection in every detail, from the arrangement of flowers in the parlor to the pressing of linens to the serving of meals at precisely appointed hours. Rose's first days at Bellamont House consisted mainly of observation and menial tasks. She was kept in the kitchen and laundry areas, learning the layout of the property and the routines of the household. The other slaves spoke little in her presence, offering only the minimal instruction necessary for her to complete assigned tasks. She learned where the linens were kept, how Madame Laval preferred her morning coffee prepared, which rooms were to be cleaned on which days, and which areas of the house the slaves were never to enter without explicit permission. The quarters where the slaves lived were set back from the main house, a row of small wooden cabins that housed the field hands and house servants in cramped, dark rooms. Rose's cabin was slightly better than most. House slaves generally received marginally better accommodations than field workers, but it was still a single room with a dirt floor, a small fireplace, and 4 pallets for sleeping. The women she lived with rose before dawn and returned after dark, speaking little, eating the rations provided by the plantation stores, and falling into exhausted sleep. On the 3rd day, Rose was called to the main house earlier than usual. A house slave named Martha, a woman of perhaps 30 who worked primarily in the kitchen, came to fetch her just as the sun was rising. "Mcia wants to see you," Martha said, her face carefully blank. "You are to be presented to Madame today. Judith will help you prepare." In the main house, Judith waited with a dress laid out, pale blue cotton with white trim, finer than anything Rose had worn in her 12 years of life. "You will put this on," Judith instructed. "I will arrange your hair. You will stand straight, keep your eyes down, speak only when spoken to, and address Madame as Madame and Mcia as Sir. Do you understand?" Rose understood. She had been prepared for this her entire life, though she had not known the specific form it would take. Her mother had taught her the survival skills necessary for an enslaved person, how to read the moods of white people, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to make oneself useful enough to be valued but not so visible as to attract unwanted attention. She changed into the blue dress, stood still while Judith braided and pinned her hair in the style Celeste Laval preferred for her house slaves, and tied on the white apron that marked her as household staff. "Remember," Judith said as she worked, her gnarled fingers surprisingly deft, "you are a gift. Mcia has purchased you as an anniversary gift for Madame. This is not a normal thing. This is not how these transactions usually occur, so you must be very, very careful." Rose did not understand what Judith meant, but she recognized the warning in the old woman's voice. She stood in the hallway outside the morning room where the Lavals took their breakfast, waiting while Henry went to fetch his wife, trying to control her trembling, trying to be as invisible as her blue dress and newly arranged hair would allow. She could hear voices from within the morning room, Henry's formal, measured tones, and Celeste's cool responses. The anniversary breakfast had been laid out on fine china, a display of domestic refinement that contrasted sharply with the human transaction about to occur. When Henry brought her into the morning room, presenting her to Celeste with words about usefulness and service, Rose kept her eyes on the floor, but she could feel Celeste's gaze on her, assessing and evaluating with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to appraising property. The silence stretched out, heavy and dangerous. Rose stood perfectly still, aware that something was happening in the space between the master and mistress, some communication occurring in their glances and postures that she could not read but could certainly feel. Then Celeste spoke, her voice smooth and cold as polished marble. "How thoughtful of you, Henry. I am sure she will be very useful." Rose was dismissed to the kitchen. She fled from the morning room, from whatever terrible thing was occurring between Mcia and Madame Laval, and found a corner in the summer kitchen where she stood trembling while the other slaves exchanged looks that confirmed what Judith had implied. Rose had been placed at the center of something dangerous, something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her, and she had no power to extract herself from it. The day proceeded with the ordinary routines of plantation life. The field hands worked under the relentless sun, chopping cotton and clearing irrigation ditches. The house slaves cleaned and cooked and served, moving through their tasks with practiced efficiency. Henry Laval spent his morning in his study, reviewing ledgers and composing letters to business associates in New Orleans. Celeste Laval received a visiting neighbor in the parlor, serving tea and discussing the upcoming social season with the careful attention to detail that had made her a respected hostess despite the whispers about the source of her husband's fortune. And Rose learned what would be expected of her. She would work directly under Celeste's supervision, which meant constant visibility, constant scrutiny, constant exposure to whatever currents of tension ran between the master and mistress of Bellamont House. She was assigned to help with Celeste's wardrobe, to maintain her personal items, to be present in the mistress's chambers and dressing room for hours each day. It was work that many house slaves would have considered preferable to field labor or kitchen duty, but Rose understood instinctively that she had not been given a privilege. She had been given a sentence. The first weeks of Rose's service to Celeste Laval established patterns that would persist for years. Each morning, Rose was summoned to the mistress's chambers before dawn to help her dress. The ritual was elaborate and time-consuming, selecting the appropriate gown from the dozens hanging in the large wardrobe, lacing the stays, arranging the underskirts and overskirts, fastening the countless small buttons that ran down the back of each dress. Celeste would stand before the tall mirror in her dressing room, turning slowly while Rose worked, examining her own reflection with critical attention. During these sessions, Celeste rarely spoke directly to Rose. Instead, she would make observations aloud, as if to herself or to the mirror, in a voice that was never raised but carried a particular quality that made Rose's stomach clench with anxiety. "This lace is not properly pressed. I suppose standards have declined at the Mercier estate, or perhaps you simply do not pay attention to detail." A pause, while Rose's hands fumbled with the lace collar. Yes, that must be it. Inattention, carelessness. Rose learned quickly that there were no correct responses to these observations. To apologize was to admit fault. To remain silent was to be insolent. To explain was to offer excuses. Celeste had created a system where Rose existed in a state of perpetual inadequacy, where every task was an opportunity to demonstrate failure. The lace was never pressed well enough. The buttons were never fastened quickly enough. The hair arrangements were never quite what Celeste had envisioned, though her instructions were deliberately vague enough that Rose could never anticipate what would be acceptable. After helping Celeste dress, Rose would attend to the mistress's breakfast, carrying trays from the kitchen to wherever Celeste chose to take her morning meal, sometimes the small morning room, sometimes the upstairs sitting room, sometimes outside on the gallery when the weather was particularly fine. She would stand nearby while Celeste ate, ready to refill coffee or retrieve a forgotten book or adjust a curtain to block the sun. This standing attendance often lasted an hour or more, during which Rose was expected to remain motionless and alert, prepared to respond instantly to any request. The other house slaves watched Rose's situation with carefully concealed expressions. They understood what was happening even if Rose herself did not fully comprehend it. Judith, who had seen similar dramas unfold over her 30 years at Bellamont House, tried to offer what guidance she could during the brief moments when they worked together in spaces where Celeste could not overhear. "Keep your face empty," Judith advised one morning when they were both in the linen room, sorting through tablecloths that needed mending. "Do not let her see that she affects you. White women like Madame, they feed on your fear and your pain. If you show nothing, it takes away some of their satisfaction." "I do not understand why she treats me this way," Rose said quietly. "I try to do everything correctly. I try to anticipate what she needs before she asks." Judith looked at the girl with something like pity in her old eyes. "Child, this has nothing to do with your work. This is about something else entirely, something that happened before you ever came here. You are just the vessel for it." Rose did not understand, but she tried to follow Judith's advice. She practiced keeping her expression neutral, her eyes downcast, her body still. She became adept at reading Celeste's moods from small signs, the particular way she moved her hands, the tone of her voice when she first spoke in the morning, the tightness around her mouth that indicated a day when nothing Rose did would be acceptable. But if Celeste's cruelty was cold and calculated, Henry Laval's behavior was marked by avoidance. He rarely looked directly at Rose during the first months of her residence at Bellamont House. When their paths crossed in the hallways or on the grounds, he would glance away, his expression uncomfortable, as though Rose's mere presence caused him physical pain. He never addressed her directly, never issued instructions to her, never acknowledged her existence beyond the barest necessities of household management. Rose began to notice something else during those first weeks, her own face. She had seen her reflection only rarely at Belle-Rive. Enslaved people were not provided mirrors, and still water was often the only way to glimpse one's own features. But at Bellamont House, Celeste's chambers contained multiple mirrors, and Rose could not help but see herself as she worked. She saw her eyes, an unusual shade of gray-green that was distinctive and memorable. She saw the shape of her face, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head. And she began to notice that she had seen these features before on someone else's face, on the master's face. The realization came gradually, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow accumulation of observations. The way Henry would look at her when he thought no one was watching, a strange expression that contained elements of guilt and recognition, and something else she could not name. The way Celeste's cruelty intensified whenever Henry was nearby, as though Rose's presence in his vicinity required particular punishment. The whispered conversations among the older house slaves that would stop abruptly when Rose entered a room. She remembered things her mother had told her, fragments of information that had not made sense at the time. How Dinah had worked at Belle-Reve during the years when young Henry Laval had been a frequent visitor there, conducting business with old Monsieur Mercier. How Dinah had sometimes been called to the sewing room to assist with accounts and fabric orders when Henry was present. How Dinah's face would take on a particular expression, resigned and sad and angry all at once, when she looked at Rose's light complexion and distinctive features. Rose was 12 years old, then 13 as summer turned to fall and fall to winter. She was still young enough that the full implications of her situation remained somewhat abstract, but she was old enough to understand that she occupied a position in the Laval household that had nothing to do with her skills as a seamstress or her potential as a domestic worker. She was a living symbol of something that had happened years before, something that connected her to Henry Laval in ways that could never be openly acknowledged, but could never be entirely hidden. The work Celeste assigned to Rose became increasingly impossible. She was made to stand for hours holding items, a shawl, a fan, a book, while Celeste decided whether to use them. The items would grow heavy in Rose's arms, her muscles cramping, but she was not permitted to lower them or shift position. She was sent to fetch things from other parts of the house, given instructions that were deliberately vague, then criticized when she returned with the wrong item. "I said the blue shawl, not the blue wrap. Are you incapable of understanding simple instructions?" She was assigned mending that required stitches so small they were barely visible, work that had to be done by candlelight that ruined her eyes, work that took hours to complete only to be criticized as inadequate. "This stitching is uneven. You will unpick it and do it again." She was made to arrange flowers in vases according to specifications that changed each time she thought she had understood them. "The roses should be at the center, not the edges. The height is wrong. The colors do not complement the room. Start again." None of this was unusual treatment for enslaved people on Louisiana plantations. Physical punishment was common. Impossible standards and arbitrary rules were tools of control used throughout the South to maintain discipline and reinforce the absolute power of owners over the owned. But there was something particularly calculated about Celeste's treatment of Rose, something that went beyond the ordinary cruelties of the slave system. This was personal. This was revenge. By the winter of 1847, Rose had learned to navigate her dangerous position through constant vigilance. She learned which times of day Celeste was likely to be most volatile: early morning before she had taken her coffee, late afternoon when the heat made everyone irritable, evenings when Henry would retreat to his study with brandy rather than spend time with his wife. She learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move through rooms without being noticed, to complete tasks preemptively so that Celeste would have fewer opportunities to find fault. She learned to distinguish between the ordinary discipline of the plantation, the overseer's harsh treatment of field hands who failed to meet quotas, the cook's sharp reprimands to kitchen workers who burned food or broke dishes, and the particular quality of attention that Celeste directed toward her. The other slaves were punished for genuine failures or infractions. Rose was punished for existing. The field hands at Bellamont House lived under their own regime of control. Thomas Garrett, the overseer, was a man who believed that enslaved people were naturally lazy and required constant supervision and frequent physical punishment to maintain productivity. He carried a whip on his rounds through the cotton fields, using it liberally on anyone who appeared to be working too slowly or resting without permission. The field hands worked from dawn to dusk during the growing season, their lives defined by the brutal repetition of planting, hoeing, chopping, and picking cotton under the relentless Louisiana sun. Rose was grateful, in a twisted way, that her position kept her in the main house rather than the fields. She had seen field hands return to the quarters in the evening, exhausted beyond measure, their hands bleeding from cotton bowls, their backs scarred from the overseer's whip. She had heard the women crying at night, had seen children as young as 7 or 8 sent out to work alongside adults, had witnessed the casual violence that defined every aspect of plantation life for those who worked the land. But she also understood that her position in the household offered no real protection. She was simply subject to a different kind of cruelty, psychological rather than physical, refined rather than crude, but no less damaging. Celeste Laval had created a prison for Rose that had no bars and no walls, only the constant presence of surveillance and judgment, the knowledge that every moment of every day was subject to scrutiny and criticism, that there was no action so small it could not be found inadequate, no task so simple it could not become an occasion for humiliation. And through it all, Henry Laval watched from a distance, saying nothing, doing nothing, permitting his wife to torture his daughter while he maintained his comfortable fiction that the situation was not of his making and therefore not his responsibility to address. The spring of 1848 brought increased tensions to Bellamont House that Rose could sense but not fully understand. Celeste's moods grew darker and more unpredictable. Some days she would ignore Rose entirely, leaving her standing in corners for hours without instruction or acknowledgement. Other days she would summon Rose repeatedly, demanding her presence for the most trivial reasons, to adjust a curtain, to move a vase from one table to another, to stand and listen while Celeste read aloud from correspondence or complained about the inadequacies of various household arrangements. Henry began spending more time away from the main house. He would leave early in the morning for the fields, ostensibly to supervise operations with the overseer, and return only for dinner, which he took in silence, while Celeste maintained a stream of polite conversation about matters of no consequence. After dinner, he would retreat immediately to his study, where he could be heard packing late into the night, the floorboards creaking overhead in the room directly above the parlor where Celeste often sat with her embroidery. The other slaves at Bellamont House navigated these tensions with the practiced caution of people who understood that they would bear the consequences of whatever conflicts existed between master and mistress. The kitchen staff worked more quickly, more quietly, trying to be invisible. The house servants moved through their duties with heightened alertness, anticipating demands before they were made, staying out of sight as much as their work permitted. Even the field hands, who had limited direct contact with the main house, seemed to sense that the atmosphere had changed, that they should keep their heads down and their attention focused on their work. Martha, the kitchen worker who had first summoned Rose to meet Celeste, offered fragments of information during the brief moments when she and Rose would cross paths. "The master and mistress, they barely speak now," Martha said one morning when they were both drawing water from the well behind the kitchen house. "It has been this way for months, but it grows worse. Something is broken between them that cannot be mended." "Is it because of me?" Rose asked, the question that had been haunting her for months finally spoken aloud. Martha gave her a long, assessing look. "You are part of it, child, but you are not the cause. The cause is much older than you, and the fault lies with those who made the choices that brought you here." Rose tried to understand what Martha meant, but the implications were too large, too complex for her 13-year-old comprehension. She knew only that she was trapped at the center of something that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her, that her mere existence seemed to be a source of pain and anger that manifested in countless small cruelties. Celeste's methods of control became more elaborate during this period. She began requiring Rose to keep a detailed accounting of her daily activities, written out each evening in a ledger that Celeste would review the following morning. This was unusual. Most house slaves were not taught to write, and requiring written documentation of routine domestic tasks served no practical purpose. But Celeste insisted, and so Rose would sit each night by candlelight, carefully forming letters that spelled out each task she had completed. Rose arranged Madame's hair. Rose pressed 3 dresses. Rose cleaned the silver candlesticks in the dining room. Rose stood attendance while Madame received visitors. The ledger became another tool for criticism. Celeste would review each entry with exaggerated attention, finding fault with Rose's penmanship, questioning the time spent on various tasks, demanding explanations for gaps in the accounting. "You spent 2 hours pressing 3 dresses? That seems excessive. Were you working slowly? Were you distracted? What were you thinking about during those 2 hours?" There were no acceptable answers to such questions. Rose learned to keep her responses minimal. "Yes, Madame," and "No, Madame," and "I will work more quickly, Madam," while understanding that the purpose of these interrogations was not to improve her work, but to reinforce her powerlessness. Meanwhile, Thomas Garrett's attention toward Rose was becoming more noticeable and more troubling. The overseer had begun finding excuses to be near the main house more frequently than his duties required. He would appear in the yard while Rose was hanging laundry, ostensibly to speak with Henry about field operations, but spending more time watching Rose work than discussing plantation business. He would make comments that started as observations. "You are growing into a handsome young woman, Rose," and progressed towards something more pointed and threatening. "You must get lonely, working in that big house all day with no company your own age." Rose tried to avoid him, but it was difficult. The plantation was not large enough that she could always arrange to be elsewhere when Garrett was present, and her duties required her to move between the main house and various outbuildings throughout the day. She began timing her tasks to avoid the hours when Garrett was most likely to be conducting business with Henry, but this strategy was imperfect. Garrett seemed to have adjusted his own schedule to increase opportunities for encounter. Judith noticed the situation and pulled Rose aside one afternoon when they were both in the linen storage room. "That man is dangerous," Judith said bluntly. "You need to be very careful. Do not let yourself be alone with him. If he corners you, scream, make noise, bring attention to the situation, even if it means you will be punished for causing a disturbance." "Should I tell Madame?" Rose asked, though she already knew the answer. Judith's expression was grim. "That would be a waste of breath, child. Madame will not protect you. She might even see it as an opportunity to be rid of you. No, you must protect yourself as best you can and hope that Garrett finds his attention drawn elsewhere before something terrible happens." The summer of 1848 was brutally hot. The cotton fields shimmered in the sun, and the main house, despite its tall ceilings and wide galleries, became stifling during the afternoon hours. Work continued regardless of the heat. Cotton did not wait for comfortable weather, and enslaved people were not permitted to slow their labor because of physical discomfort. The field hands worked under conditions that sometimes caused them to collapse from heat exhaustion. The house slaves tried to complete their tasks during the cooler morning and evening hours, but Celeste's demands did not adjust to accommodate the weather. Rose spent hours standing in overheated rooms, holding items or waiting for instructions while sweat ran down her back and her vision blurred from the heat. She learned not to show discomfort, not to ask for water, not to seek relief. To do so would be to invite criticism for weakness, for self-indulgence, for failing to meet the standards expected of household staff. It was during this hot summer that Rose began to fully understand the nature of her connection to Henry Lavel. The realization had been building for months, assembled from fragments of overheard conversation, from the resemblance she could not help but see in mirrors, from the way both Henry and Celeste reacted to her presence. But understanding crystallized one afternoon when she was cleaning Henry's study, a task that was usually performed by one of the other house slaves, but which Celeste had assigned to Rose with particular emphasis on thoroughness. The study was lined with books and dominated by a large desk covered with ledgers and correspondence. Rose had been instructed to dust every surface, to empty the ashes from the fireplace even though no fires had been lit for months, to arrange the papers on the desk without disturbing their order, an impossible task that she attempted with trembling hands. Henry had forgotten something and returned to retrieve it while Rose was working. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, his expression stricken. For a long moment they stared at each other, father and daughter, master and slave, two people connected by blood and separated by everything that blood meant in the world they inhabited. "You have my eyes," Henry said finally, his voice so quiet Rose almost did not hear him. Rose did not know how to respond. To acknowledge the observation would be to speak an unspoken truth, to name the relationship that could never be named. She stood frozen, dust cloth in hand, waiting for whatever would come next. But Henry simply turned and left, retreating from the study and from the unbearable reality of his daughter's presence in his household, and Rose was left alone with the certain knowledge of what she was to him, what he had done, and what it meant for her existence at Bellamont House. That evening Rose heard shouting from the main house, rare enough that several slaves stopped their work to listen. The voices were Henry's and Celeste's, raised in anger though the words were not distinct enough to be understood from the quarters. The argument lasted a long time, and when it was over, Henry was seen leaving the property on horseback, not returning until the following day. Celeste remained in her chambers, refusing all meals, speaking to no one. The next morning, Celeste summoned Rose earlier than usual. Her face was pale and composed, but there was something in her eyes, a cold determination, that made Rose's stomach clench with fear. "You will have additional duties," Celeste announced. "In addition to your regular work, you will now be responsible for cleaning the entire second floor of the house each day. You will complete this work before dawn so that it does not interfere with your other responsibilities." This was impossible. The second floor contained 6 bedrooms, 2 sitting rooms, and various storage areas. To clean all of these spaces thoroughly would require hours of work. To complete this work before dawn would mean rising in the middle of the night, working by candlelight, getting perhaps 2 or 3 hours of sleep each day. "Yes, Madame," Rose said, because there was nothing else she could say. For the next several weeks, Rose existed in a state of exhaustion so profound it became difficult to think clearly. She would rise at midnight or 1 in the morning, making her way to the main house in darkness, cleaning rooms by the light of a single candle while the Lavels slept. She would work until dawn, then begin her regular duties attending to Celeste, then continue with various household tasks until late evening, then return to the quarters to sleep for a few hours before beginning again. Her hands became raw from constant scrubbing, her eyes burned from lack of sleep and the strain of working by inadequate light. She grew thinner, her dresses hanging loose on a frame that had never been substantial. The other slaves watched with concern but could do nothing. Judith sometimes left food for Rose in the kitchen, small offerings that Rose tried to eat, though she was often too tired to be hungry. Henry must have noticed Rose's deteriorating condition, but he said nothing. He avoided looking at her when their paths crossed, avoided being in rooms where she was working, maintained his careful fiction that he bore no responsibility for her suffering. The crisis came in the summer of 1850, when Rose was 15 years old. She had been at Bellamont House for 3 years that had transformed her from a frightened child into a young woman who understood exactly how little power she possessed and how much danger she faced. The exhaustion and deprivation had etched themselves onto her face and body. She was thin to the point of frailty, her eyes perpetually shadowed with fatigue, her movements careful and constrained from constant vigilance. Thomas Garrett's attention had intensified over those 3 years. What had begun as comments and prolonged glances had progressed to deliberate encounters, to touches that lasted too long, to suggestions that grew increasingly explicit. Rose had become adept at avoiding him, at arranging her tasks to minimize opportunities for contact, at ensuring she was never alone in isolated areas of the property. But vigilance had its limits, and Garrett was patient and determined. It happened on a humid afternoon in July. The heat was oppressive, the air thick enough to make breathing difficult. Most of the household was seeking relief in whatever shade could be found. Henry was in his study, reviewing accounts with a cotton factor from New Orleans. Celeste was in her chambers, taking her afternoon rest. The kitchen staff was preparing the evening meal, working slowly in the stifling heat of the summer kitchen. Rose had been sent to the laundry house behind the main building to wash a set of table linens that Celeste had declared inadequate and demanded be cleaned immediately. The laundry house was a small wooden structure containing large tubs for washing and a fireplace for heating water. It was isolated from the main house and the quarters, surrounded by trees that offered shade but also privacy. Rose was alone. The other woman who usually worked in the laundry was sick with a fever that had been spreading through the quarters, confined to her cabin under the care of the elderly woman who served as the plantation's informal healer. Rose had volunteered to handle the washing herself rather than ask Celeste to postpone the task, knowing that any delay would be interpreted as insolence or laziness and would result in punishment. She was bent over one of the washing tubs, scrubbing at a stubborn stain, when she heard the door open behind her. She turned and saw Thomas Garrett standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. The expression on his face made her blood run cold. There was no pretense now, no false courtesy, just naked intention. "Afternoon, Rose," Garrett said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Thought I would see how you were managing with all this heavy work." "I am managing fine, sir," Rose said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her throat. "Thank you for your concern." "Now that is not very friendly," Garrett said, moving closer. "I have been trying to be kind to you for 2 years now, and you just keep running away. That is not polite, Rose. That is not respectful to a white man who is trying to show you consideration." Rose backed away from the washing tub, looking for something she could use as a weapon. But there was nothing within reach, except wet linens and wooden paddles used for stirring laundry. Garrett was between her and the door, and he was much larger and stronger than she was. She considered screaming, but the laundry house was far enough from the main buildings that no one might hear, and even if they did, who would intervene to protect a slave girl from a white overseer? "Please, sir," Rose said, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful, trying to find words that might defuse the situation. "Please let me finish my work. Madame is expecting these linens to be cleaned, and she will be very angry if I do not complete the task." "Madame does not need to know anything about this," Garrett said, reaching for her. "This can be our little secret. You be nice to me, Rose, and I will make things easier for you. I can speak to Monsieur Laval on your behalf, get you better assignments, lighter work. Would you like that?" Rose tried to move away, but Garrett grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. She pulled back, trying to free herself, and he slapped her across the face with enough force to make her ears ring and her vision blur. She stumbled backward, hit the edge of the washing tub, and fell to the dirt floor. Garrett was on her immediately, his weight pinning her down, his hands tearing at her dress. Rose fought with everything she had, scratching at his face, trying to scream though his hand was over her mouth, kicking and twisting and doing anything she could to get away. But Garrett was experienced at this kind of violence, had done this before to other enslaved women who had no power to resist and no recourse to justice. He was angry now, angry that she was fighting, angry that she was not submitting quietly as he believed she should. The struggle lasted several minutes. At some point, Rose managed to grab one of the wooden washing paddles and hit Garrett across the side of the head with it. The blow was not hard enough to knock him unconscious, but it stunned him enough that his grip loosened. Rose scrambled out from under him, her dress torn, her face bruised and bleeding where he had struck her, and ran for the door. She burst out of the laundry house and ran toward the main house, not thinking about consequences or proper behavior or anything except the need to get away, to find safety, to make someone intervene. She could hear Garrett behind her, shouting, but she did not stop. She ran Jan 4. Up the back stairs and into the house, past the startled kitchen staff who stared at her torn clothing and bleeding face, straight to Henry's study where she knew he was conducting business. She did not knock. She simply pushed open the door and stumbled inside, interrupting Henry's meeting with the cotton factor, standing before her father with her torn dress and her bruised face and her desperate, terrified eyes. Henry and his business associate stared at her. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then Henry stood up from behind his desk, his face going pale as he took in Rose's condition. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with alarm. Rose stood before him, trembling, and in that moment of desperation and terror, She spoke the words that had been forbidden for 3 years, the truth that everyone knew but no one was permitted to acknowledge. "You are my father," she said, her voice breaking. "Please help me." The silence that followed was absolute. The cotton factor sat frozen in his chair, his expression shocked. Henry stared at his daughter, at Rose, at this girl who carried his blood and bore his features, who had just named their relationship in front of a witness, who had broken the most fundamental rule of their impossible situation. For a moment, something flickered across Henry's face, recognition, perhaps even compassion. He saw Rose not as property or as a problem to be managed, but as his child, his daughter, a human being who needed his protection. He took a step toward her, reaching out as if to offer comfort or assistance. Then Celeste appeared in the doorway. She must have heard the commotion, must have emerged from her chambers to investigate the disturbance. She stood there in the doorway, perfectly composed despite the chaos, her eyes taking in the scene, Rose with her torn dress and desperate expression, Henry frozen mid-step with his hand extended, the cotton factor staring in horrified fascination at the drama unfolding before him. Celeste's face showed no emotion, but her voice when she spoke was cold as winter. "Get out," she said to Rose. "Go to your quarters and stay there. Do not come back to this house until you are sent for." Rose looked at Henry, hoping desperately for some sign that he would contradict his wife, that he would offer the protection she had begged for. But Henry said nothing. He stood there, his hand still partially extended, caught between his guilt and his cowardice, between his daughter's need and his wife's fury, and in that moment of paralysis he made his choice. He chose silence. He chose inaction. He chose his comfort over his daughter's safety. Rose fled. She ran from the study, from the house, from the shocked faces of the other slaves who had witnessed her arrival, and stumbled toward the quarters. She made it to the small cabin she shared with 3 other women and collapsed on her pallet, her body shaking with sobs she could no longer suppress. The other women in the cabin tried to comfort her, but Rose was beyond comfort. She had finally spoken the truth, had finally claimed her father, had finally asked for the protection that any child should expect from a parent, and he had done nothing. He had stood there in his study with his business associate as witness to his shame, and he had allowed his wife to send his daughter away, had chosen his reputation over her life. Martha, who had followed Rose from the main house, knelt beside her pallet. "Child," she said softly, "you should not have said those words. You should not have named what cannot be named. Do you understand what you have done?" Rose understood. She had broken the fiction that allowed everyone to pretend they did not know what they knew. She had forced Henry to confront his paternity in front of a witness, had made it impossible for him to maintain the comfortable lie that Rose was just another slave with no particular connection to him. And in doing so, she had made herself even more dangerous to Celeste, even more vulnerable to whatever revenge Celeste would devise. The consequences came swiftly. That evening, as the sun was setting and the field hands were returning from their day's labor, the sheriff arrived at Bellamont House. He came in his official capacity, summoned by Celeste Laval to investigate a theft. A valuable piece of jewelry had been stolen from Madame Laval's chambers, a gold brooch set with pearls and a small ruby, an heirloom from her mother that held both monetary and sentimental value. The brooch, Celeste informed the sheriff, had been taken by Rose, the young slave girl who worked as Celeste's personal attendant. A search of Rose's belongings in the quarters had revealed the missing brooch hidden among her few possessions. It was, Celeste said with perfect composure, a clear case of theft, and she wished to press charges to the fullest extent of the law. The sheriff, a man named William Porter, who depended on the goodwill of wealthy planters like Henry Laval for his political position, accepted Celeste's account without question. He went to the quarters with 2 deputies and arrested Rose, binding her hands and placing her in the back of a wagon for transport to the parish jail. Rose went quietly, understanding that resistance would only make things worse. She knew the brooch had been planted in her belongings, knew this was Celeste's revenge for the scene in Henry's study, knew that there was no defense she could offer that would be believed. Enslaved people could not testify against white people in Louisiana courts. No one would take her word over Celeste's, and the physical evidence of the brooch found in her possession would be considered conclusive proof of guilt. As the wagon pulled away from Bellamont House, Rose looked back and saw Henry standing at a window of his study, watching her departure. Their eyes met across the distance, father and daughter, master and slave, two people connected by blood and separated by everything that blood meant in the society they inhabited. Henry's expression was anguished, but he made no move to intervene, made no protest to the sheriff, made no attempt to prevent his daughter's arrest. Rose turned away. She did not look back again as the wagon carried her toward the parish jail, toward a trial that would be a foregone conclusion, toward a future that held nothing but suffering unless something fundamental changed. Behind her, at Bellamont House, Henry Lavel stood at his window and watched until the wagon disappeared from view, then returned to his desk and his ledgers and his brandy, choosing once again to do nothing. The parish jail was a stone building that held perhaps a dozen prisoners at any given time. Men and women awaiting trial, people convicted of minor offenses serving short sentences, and occasionally enslaved people accused of crimes against property or white authority. Rose was placed in a cell with two other women, one awaiting trial for theft and another serving time for running away from her owner. The cell was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single barred window set high in the wall that provided minimal light and ventilation. The conditions were harsh. Prisoners were given 1 meal a day, usually cornmeal mush, and occasionally a piece of salt pork. Water was provided in a single bucket that all prisoners shared. There was no privacy, no comfort, no relief from the heat that made the stone cell feel like an oven during the day and offered little coolness at night. Rose had endured difficult conditions all her life. Slavery was not a life of comfort, but the jail represented a new level of deprivation, a calculated disregard for basic human needs that stripped away any pretense that she was considered a person rather than a criminal animal. But the physical hardship was nothing compared to the psychological torment of knowing that she was being punished not for any crime she had committed, but simply for existing, for being the living evidence of Henry Lavel's past and Celeste Lavel's humiliation. Rose spent her first days in the jail in a state of numb despair, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to imagine any future beyond the inevitable conviction and whatever sentence would follow. The other women in her cell watched her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. The woman awaiting trial for theft, a house slave named Beulah who had allegedly stolen fabric from her mistress, recognized the quality of Rose's features and the circumstances that suggested this was no ordinary theft case. "You are that girl from Bellamont House," Beulah said on the second day. "The one they are saying stole jewelry from Madame Lavel." "I did not steal anything," Rose said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying. "It was planted in my belongings. This is Madame's revenge for something else, something that has nothing to do with theft." "That does not matter," the other woman said. She was older, perhaps 40, with scars on her back that spoke of previous punishments. "What matters is what they say you did, not what you actually did. The truth is not relevant when white people decide you are guilty." Rose knew this was correct. She had lived her entire life in a system where the truth of enslaved people's experiences, the reality of their humanity, the facts of their circumstances were all subordinate to the narratives white people chose to believe. She could protest her innocence all she wanted, but no one with power would listen, and no one without power could help her. But as the days passed and Rose waited for her trial, something shifted inside her. The despair did not disappear. It was too profound, too justified by her circumstances to simply evaporate. But alongside it, a different feeling emerged. A cold, clear anger that gave her something to hold on to, some core of self that refused to accept that this was all she would ever be, all she was permitted to be. Rose began to pay attention to everything around her with new intensity. She listened to the conversations of the jailer and his assistants as they moved through the building, learning what she could about the legal procedures she would face, the judge who would hear her case, the penalties typically imposed for theft. She observed the routines of the jail, when meals were delivered, when the cells were opened for brief exercise periods in the small yard behind the building, when the night guard was most likely to be inattentive or asleep. She was not planning escape. That was impossible from a stone jail with barred windows and locked doors. But she was preparing herself mentally for whatever came next, refusing to remain passive in the face of her own destruction. If she was to be convicted, if she was to be sent to the state prison or sold to a chain gang or transporting to the Deep South, she would face it with her eyes open and her mind alert, looking for any opportunity, any advantage, any possibility of changing her circumstances. The woman who had run away from her owner, whose name was Sarah, noticed Rose's transformation. "You are planning something," Sarah said one evening when they were alone in the cell, the third woman having been released after her trial. "I can see it in your face. You have stopped crying and started thinking." "I am not planning anything," Rose said. "I am just trying to understand what will happen to me." "That is a kind of planning," Sarah observed. "That is how resistance begins, with paying attention, with refusing to accept what they tell you about yourself, with keeping some part of yourself separate from their control." Sarah had been caught 3 times trying to escape to the north, caught and returned and punished with increasing severity each time. She bore the scars of those punishments, the marks of whippings, a brand on her shoulder that marked her as a chronic runaway, but she had not been broken by these experiences. There was something in her eyes, some core of defiance, that remained intact despite everything that had been done to her. "Why do you keep trying?" Rose asked. "After being caught 3 times, after all the punishment, why do you keep attempting escape?" "Because the alternative is to accept that this is all there is," Sarah said simply. "To accept that I am property, that I have no right to my own life, that I will live and die according to someone else's will. I cannot accept that. So I keep trying, even knowing I will probably be caught again, even knowing the punishment will be worse each time, because trying is the only way I can remain human." Rose thought about Sarah's words during the long nights in the jail cell, when sleep would not come and she had nothing to do but think. She thought about her mother, Dinah, left behind at Belle Reve, wondering what had become of her daughter. She thought about Henry Laval, standing at his window watching her be taken away, choosing his comfort over her freedom. She thought about Celeste Laval, systematically destroying Rose's life as revenge for sins Rose had not committed. And she thought about what it meant to remain human in a system designed to reduce people to property, to objects, to things that could be bought and sold, and used without regard for their wishes or their suffering. Sarah's insistence on attempting escape, even in the face of repeated failure and brutal punishment, was a kind of resistance, a refusal to internalize the definitions imposed by slaveholders. Rose began to understand that there were different forms of resistance. Not all of them involved running away or open rebellion. Some resistance was quieter, more internal, but no less significant. The resistance of remembering who you were, of maintaining dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away, of refusing to believe the lies that slavery told about enslaved people's worth and humanity. Rose had been in jail for 2 weeks when Henry Laval came to visit her. It was late at night, well past the hour when visitors were normally permitted, but Henry had brought a bottle of whiskey for the jailer and some coins that changed hands in the shadows outside Rose's cell. The jailer opened the cell door and escorted Rose to a small visiting room, a bare space with a wooden table and 2 chairs, then left them alone. Henry looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, his clothes rumpled as though he had been sleeping in them. He sat down heavily in one of the chairs and gestured for Rose to sit across from him. For a long time neither of them spoke, father and daughter separated by a wooden table and by everything that table represented, the social structures, the legal frameworks, the moral compromises that made their situation possible. "I am sorry," Henry said finally, his voice rough. "I am sorry for all of it, for bringing you here, for not protecting you, for being too weak to do what I should have done." Rose looked at her father and felt a complicated mixture of emotions: anger, grief, pity, contempt. "Sorry does not change anything," she said flatly. "Sorry does not free me from this jail. Sorry does not undo 3 years of Madame's cruelty. Sorry does not give me back my mother or my childhood or any possibility of a decent life." "The trial," Henry continued, as though Rose had not spoken. "Celeste is determined to see you convicted. She wants you sent to the state prison or sold out of state. She wants you gone. Removed from her sight, punished for existing." "And what do you want?" Rose asked. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as though she were asking about the weather rather than her own fate. Henry looked at his hands. "I want to make this right, but I do not know how. If I testify that you did not steal the brooch, Celeste will know I am lying to protect you. It will confirm everything she suspects. It will make the situation worse. But if I do not testify, you will be convicted. There is no evidence in your favor, no witnesses who can speak for you." "So I am going to be convicted," Rose said. "And you are going to let it happen because protecting me would be inconvenient for you." "It is not that simple," Henry protested. "Yes, it is," Rose interrupted, and now there was steel in her voice, a hardness that had not been there before. "It is exactly that simple. You could free me. You could acknowledge me as your daughter and free me. You have that power, but you will not use it because it would cost you too much, your reputation, your marriage, your position in society. So instead you will let me be convicted of a crime I did not commit, and you will tell yourself that the situation is complicated, that there is nothing you can do, that you are somehow not responsible for what happens to me." Henry had no answer to that. The truth of Rose's words hung in the air between them, undeniable and unforgivable. He sat there for another few minutes, perhaps hoping Rose would offer some absolution, some understanding that would ease his guilt. But Rose offered nothing. She simply looked at him with clear, cold eyes that reflected his own features back at him, a living mirror of his moral failure. Finally, Henry stood to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at his daughter one last time. "I wish things were different," he said quietly. "Wishing is not the same as doing," Rose replied. Henry left the jail that night and returned to Bellamont House, to his study and his brandy and his ledgers, while Rose was escorted back to her cell. But something had changed in that visit. Rose had spoken truth to her father without fear, without deference, without any expectation that he would suddenly become the man he should have been. She had seen him clearly, not as a powerful master or an authority figure, but as a weak, selfish man who chose his own comfort over his daughter's life, over and over again. That clarity, that refusal to maintain the comfortable fictions that made slavery bearable for slaveholders, was its own form of resistance. Rose could not change her circumstances through that clear-eyed assessment of her father's failure, but she could refuse to accept his narrative about the complexity of the situation, could refuse to absolve him of responsibility, could maintain her own understanding of moral truth even when that truth had no power to alter her fate. The other forms of resistance Rose engaged in during her time in jail were small and largely invisible to her jailers. She helped the other women in her cell, sharing what little food she received, offering what comfort she could, listening to their stories and validating their experiences. She kept her mind active, reciting to herself the poems and passages from books that her mother had taught her, calculating numbers, planning imaginary journeys to places she would never see. She also began, in her own mind, to construct a different narrative about her life and her identity. The narrative that Celeste wanted Rose to accept was one of shame and illegitimacy, Rose as the bastard daughter of a white man and an enslaved woman, evidence of moral failure, something to be hidden and punished and ultimately erased. But Rose began to tell herself a different story. She was Dinah's daughter, inheritor of her mother's skill and dignity. She was a survivor of impossible circumstances, someone who had endured years of systematic cruelty without losing her essential humanity. She was a young woman with intelligence and capability who deserved better than the life she had been given. This internal narrative had no practical power. It could not free her from jail, could not influence the trial, could not change the structural realities of slavery that defined her legal status as property rather than person. But it gave Rose something to hold onto, some conception of herself that was not defined entirely by the people who had power over her. And that internal resistance, that refusal to accept the identity that slaveholders attempted to impose, was how many enslaved people maintained their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The trial was scheduled for August 3, 1852, 3 weeks after Rose's arrest. During those weeks, the machinery of the legal system ground forward with the inexorable efficiency of institutions designed to protect property rights and maintain social hierarchies. The charges were formally filed. A court-appointed attorney was assigned to Rose's defense, a young man named Michael Beaumont, who had been practicing law for less than a year and who clearly viewed this assignment as an unwelcome obligation rather than an opportunity for justice. Beaumont visited Rose once in the jail, conducting an interview that lasted perhaps 15 minutes. He asked her perfunctory questions about the theft charge, listened to her protestations of innocence with an expression that suggested he had heard similar claims from every criminal he had ever encountered, and informed her that her best option was to plead guilty and hope for leniency from the judge. When Rose insisted she had not stolen the brooch, that it had been planted in her belongings by Celeste Laval as revenge for other matters, Beaumont sighed and explained with barely concealed impatience that such defenses were unlikely to be credited by the court. "Miss Rose," Beaumont said, using the honorific in a way that was both technically correct and somehow condescending, "you must understand your situation. You are a slave accused of stealing from your owner. The owner has testified to the theft. The item was found in your possession, and there are no witnesses who can contradict the accusation. Even if what you say is true, even if Madame Laval did place the brooch in your belongings, you have no way to prove that. Your testimony will not be admitted in court. No enslaved person can testify against a white person in Louisiana, so we have no defense except to appeal to the judge's mercy." "Then why bother with a trial at all?" Rose asked bitterly. "If the verdict is already determined, if nothing I say will be heard or believed, why go through this pretense of justice?" Beaumont looked uncomfortable. "The law requires certain procedures to be followed," he said stiffly. "That is why we have trials, even in cases where the outcome seems clear." "The law requires procedures," Rose repeated, "but not justice, not truth, just procedures." Beaumont had no response to that observation. He left the jail shortly afterward, telling Rose he would do his best to argue for a lenient sentence, but offering no real hope that the trial would result in anything other than conviction. In the days leading up to the trial, Rose learned from Sarah and Beulah about how such proceedings typically unfolded. The trials of enslaved people accused of crimes were generally brief, often lasting less than an hour, and followed predictable patterns. The white accuser would testify, describing the crime and the evidence. White witnesses, if any, would corroborate the accusation. The defense attorney would make pro forma objections and arguments that everyone understood would be disregarded. The judge would deliver a verdict based almost entirely on the testimony of white people, and sentencing would follow immediately. "The whole thing is theater," Sarah said bluntly. "It is designed to make white people feel that they are being fair, that they are following proper legal procedures, but the outcome is never in doubt. If a white person accuses a slave of a crime, the slave is guilty. That is the only principle that matters." The courthouse was packed on the morning of August 3rd. Trials were public entertainment in small Louisiana parishes, and a case involving the prominent Laval family had drawn a substantial crowd. Planters and their wives, merchants from the nearby town, curious townspeople, and various others filed into the courthouse, taking seats on the wooden benches that filled the room. The atmosphere was not somber, as Rose had imagined a court of justice should be, but rather festive. People chatted with each other, discussed their business affairs, exchanged gossip about local matters entirely unrelated to the proceedings about to begin. Rose was brought into the courthouse in chains, escorted by the sheriff and a deputy. She was taken to a small dock at the front of the room where accused persons stood during their trials. The chains made it difficult to stand comfortably, and Rose was acutely aware of how she must appear to the assembled crowd. A young enslaved woman, thin and poorly dressed, marked already as guilty by her circumstances. Henry and Celeste Laval sat in the front row of the spectator area. Henry looked ill, his face pale and drawn. Celeste sat perfectly erect, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. She was dressed in a dark blue silk dress appropriate to the seriousness of the occasion, and she exuded an air of dignified grief, a respectable woman wronged by the theft of a treasured family heirloom. The judge, a man named Rutledge who had served on the parish bench for 15 years, entered the courtroom and called the proceedings to order. He was a portly man in his 60s, respected in the community, known for his strict interpretation of property law and his firm belief in maintaining social order through the vigorous enforcement of legal hierarchies. The trial began with Celeste's testimony. She took the stand with grace, answering the prosecutor's questions in a clear, steady voice. She described the brooch, a gold piece set with pearls and a small ruby, a gift from her mother on her wedding day, of both monetary value and profound sentimental importance. She described discovering it missing from her jewelry box where it was normally kept. She described searching the house with increasing concern, finally deciding to search the quarters where the slaves lived. And there, in the cabin occupied by Rose, hidden among the girl's meager possessions, the brooch had been found. "And you are certain this is the same brooch that was missing from your jewelry box?" the prosecutor asked. "I am absolutely certain," Celeste replied, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "It belonged to my mother. I would recognize it anywhere." "Did Rose have any authorized access to your chambers, any legitimate reason to have such an item in her possession?" "None whatsoever," Celeste said firmly. "Rose worked as my personal attendant, so she was frequently in my chambers, but she had no right to take my property, no right to remove anything from my jewelry box. The theft was a complete breach of trust." Michael Beaumont, Rose's attorney, rose to cross-examine Celeste, but his questions were perfunctory and ineffective. He asked whether Celeste might have misplaced the brooch and simply forgotten about it. Celeste responded with dignity that she was quite certain of when and how the brooch had gone missing. He asked whether anyone else might have had access to Celeste's chambers and could have been responsible for the theft. Celeste noted that while other slaves did clean her rooms, only Rose had regular unsupervised access to her jewelry box. The sheriff testified next, corroborating Celeste's account. He had been summoned to Bellamont House in response to the reported theft. He had accompanied Madame Laval to the quarters where a search of Rose's belongings had revealed the missing brooch. It was a straightforward case, the sheriff testified. The stolen property was found in the accused's possession. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Beaumont's cross-examination of the sheriff was even briefer than his questioning of Celeste. He established that the sheriff had not personally witnessed the theft, had not observed Rose with the brooch prior to its discovery in the quarters, had no evidence beyond the brooch's location to suggest Rose's guilt. But these points made no difference. The brooch had been found in Rose's possession, and that physical evidence was considered conclusive proof of guilt. The trial then moved to Rose's defense, such as it was. Beaumont called no witnesses. There were no witnesses who could testify on Rose's behalf, no one who could contradict Celeste's account or offer an alternative explanation for how the brooch came to be in Rose's cabin. Rose herself could not testify. Louisiana law explicitly prohibited enslaved people from testifying in court against white people, and Beaumont did not even attempt to challenge this restriction. Instead, Beaumont made a brief closing argument that focused not on Rose's innocence, but on requesting lenience in sentencing. He noted that Rose was young, that she had no history of theft or other misconduct, that perhaps the temptation of such a valuable item had simply been too great for a girl who owned nothing of her own. He suggested that harsh punishment might not be necessary, that Rose could be adequately disciplined through other means, additional work requirements, perhaps, or temporary restriction of privileges. It was a closing argument that conceded guilt while pleading for mercy, and it satisfied no one. The prosecutor delivered his own closing statement emphasizing the seriousness of theft, the need to maintain discipline among enslaved populations, the importance of protecting property rights that formed the foundation of Louisiana's economic prosperity. If enslaved people could steal from their owners without facing severe consequences, the prosecutor argued, the entire social order would be threatened. Judge Rutledge listened to both arguments with an expression of judicial neutrality, though the outcome had been determined from the moment the charges were filed. He took perhaps 5 minutes to deliver his verdict, speaking in the formal, measured tones that judges used to lend gravity to decisions that were foreordained. In the matter of the theft charges against the slave girl Rose, Judge Rutledge intoned, this court finds the evidence clear and convincing. The stolen property was discovered in the accused's possession. The owner's testimony is credible and uncontradicted. The defense has offered no substantive rebuttal to the charges. Therefore, this court finds the accused guilty of theft. The courtroom buzzed with conversation. This was the expected outcome, but hearing it formally pronounced created a moment of drama that the spectators had come to witness. Rose stood in the dock, her face carefully empty, trying to show no reaction. She had known this verdict was inevitable, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a blow. Judge Rutledge continued, moving immediately to sentencing. The theft of property from one's owner is a serious offense that strikes at the foundation of the relationship between master and slave. This court recognizes that harsh punishment is necessary to maintain proper order and discipline. However, the court also takes into consideration the youth of the accused and her lack of prior offenses. Therefore, this court sentences the accused to be returned to her owner's custody, with the recommendation that she be sold out of state to prevent further difficulties in the household. It was a compromise sentence, not the state prison that Celeste had apparently wanted, but still a severe punishment. To be sold out of state meant Rose would be taken from Louisiana, likely transporting to the Deep South where conditions were notoriously brutal, separated permanently from any possibility of contact with her mother or anyone she had known. It was a sentence designed to satisfy the need for punishment while avoiding the expense and complication of long-term imprisonment. Beaumont made no objection to the sentence. Henry Laval sat frozen in his seat, his face gray, and Celeste Laval allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, her revenge against Rose complete, or so she thought. Then Henry Laval stood up. The courtroom fell silent as Henry rose to his feet. Judge Rutledge, who had been preparing to dismiss the proceedings, paused and looked at Henry with mild surprise. It was unusual for spectators to interrupt at this stage of a trial, and Henry Laval was well known in the parish, a man whose cotton operations and business connections made him influential in local affairs. "Your Honor," Henry said, his voice rough but clear enough to carry through the courtroom, "I wish to address the court." Celeste turned in her seat to stare at her husband, her face suddenly alert with alarm. She half rose, as though to prevent him from speaking, but Henry was already moving toward the front of the courtroom, already committing himself to words that could not be unspoken. "Monsieur Laval," Judge Rutledge said carefully, "the verdict has been delivered and sentencing has been completed. If you have information relevant to this case, you should have come forward during the trial proper. It is irregular to speak now." "Nevertheless, Your Honor, I must speak," Henry said. He reached the front of the courtroom and turned to face not just the judge, but the assembled crowd, the spectators who represented Louisiana society, the people whose opinions and judgments he had spent his adult life courting and fearing. "The girl is innocent," Henry said clearly. "The brooch was not stolen, it was misplaced. My wife was mistaken in her accusation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Celeste had gone white, then red, her hands gripping the arms of her seat so tightly her knuckles showed pale beneath the skin. Michael Beaumont looked stunned. Judge Rutledge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. "Monsieur Laval," the judge said when the noise had subsided somewhat, "are you saying that your wife has lied to this court? This is a serious accusation to make, particularly against one's own wife. Are you certain you wish to proceed with this claim?" Henry hesitated. He could feel Celeste's eyes boring into him, could feel the weight of the decision he was making. If he continued, if he publicly contradicted his wife's testimony, he would humiliate her in front of the entire parish. Their marriage, already damaged beyond repair, would be completely destroyed. People would ask questions about why he was so determined to protect this particular slave girl. His reputation, his carefully constructed social position, everything he had worked to build would be jeopardized. But if he did not continue, Rose would be sold out of state. She would be sent away, likely to some brutal plantation in Mississippi or Alabama or further south, where conditions were even harsher than in Louisiana. She would suffer and perhaps die because of his cowardice, because he chose his comfort over her life one more time. Henry thought about the night he had visited Rose in jail, about the cold clarity in her eyes when she had told him that wishing was not the same as doing. He thought about Dinah, Rose's mother, whom he had used and abandoned. He thought about all the choices he had made, all the moral compromises, all the moments when he had chosen the easy path over the right path. "I am certain," Henry said, his voice steadier now. "I am saying that there has been a misunderstanding. The brooch was not stolen. I ask this court to dismiss the charges and release the girl to my custody." Judge Rutledge looked at Celeste, who sat rigid in her seat, her face a mask of fury and humiliation barely contained beneath a veneer of aristocratic composure. He looked at Henry, who stood with his shoulders back and his head high, looking more determined than anyone had seen him look in years. And Judge Rutledge, who was a practical man, and who understood that he was witnessing the public dissolution of one of the parish's most prominent marriages, made the only decision he could reasonably make. "If the owner indicates that the theft charge was made in error," the judge said slowly, choosing his words with care, "then this court has no basis to proceed with prosecution. The victim of a theft is the one who must press charges, and if that victim now states there was no theft, then legally speaking, there is no crime to punish." He paused, perhaps hoping that Henry would reconsider, would step back from this public repudiation of his wife's testimony. But Henry said nothing, simply stood waiting for the judge to complete the legal formalities. "Very well," Judge Rutledge said finally, "the verdict of guilty is set aside. The charges are dismissed. The accused is released from custody and returned to the ownership of Henry Lavel." He banged his gavel sharply, as though trying to end the proceedings before the situation became even more irregular. "This court is adjourned." The sheriff moved to unlock Rose's chains. She stood in the dock, not quite believing what had just happened, not quite trusting that she was actually being released. Henry walked over to her and said quietly, barely audible over the noise of the courtroom's excited conversations, "Come with me." They walked out of the courthouse together, father and daughter, while the crowd watched and whispered and speculated about what they had just witnessed. Celeste remained in her seat, too shocked and too angry to move, her carefully planned revenge unraveling in the most public and humiliating way possible. The ride back to Bellamont House was conducted in absolute silence. Rose sat in the back of the carriage, Henry and Celeste in the front, the space between them crackling with unspoken rage and recrimination. When they arrived at the plantation, Celeste went immediately to her chambers and locked the door. She would remain there for the next 3 days, refusing all meals, refusing to see anyone, nursing her humiliation in solitude. Henry went to his study. Rose was sent to the quarters, where the author-slaves looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear, understanding that something fundamental had shifted, but not knowing what would come next. What came next arrived 3 days later. Henry had spent those days in his study, drinking brandy and writing letters and making arrangements. He had not spoken to Celeste, who remained locked in her chambers. He had not spoken to Rose, who waited in the quarters with growing anxiety, knowing that the situation could not remain as it was, that some resolution must come even if she could not imagine what form it would take. On the 3rd day after the trial, Henry summoned Rose to his study. She came reluctantly, still uncertain of what his intervention at the courthouse had meant, still unable to trust that anything good could come from this man who was her father and her owner and who had failed her so completely so many times. Henry was standing by the window when she entered, looking out at the cotton fields that represented his wealth and his success and the source of all the moral compromises that had brought them to this moment. He did not turn around when Rose came in, did not look at her as he began to speak. "I have arranged for you to be sold," he said without preamble, "to a family in Texas, people named Harper. They are respectable, known to treat their slaves reasonably well. You will leave tomorrow morning." Rose felt something cold settle in her stomach, so this was the resolution. She had been freed from jail only to be sold away, sent to strangers in a distant state, removed from Louisiana and from any possibility of seeing her mother again. It was better than prison, she supposed, but it was still exile, still punishment for the crime of existing. "I understand," she said quietly, keeping her voice neutral. "No," Henry said, finally turning to look at her. "You do not understand. The sale is a fiction. The Harpers are abolitionists. They will take you to Texas, and then they will help you get to Mexico. From there, you can make your way north to the Free States, or you can stay in Mexico if you prefer. You will be free, Rose, truly free." Rose stared at her father, unable to process what he was saying. Free. The word seemed impossible, a concept so foreign to her lived experience that she could not quite grasp it. Henry reached into his desk and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is for you," he said, holding it out. $200 in gold coins. "It is the price I paid for you 5 years ago. It is not enough, not nearly enough to compensate for everything that has happened, but it is what I can give you. Use it to start your life wherever you decide to go." Rose took the pouch with trembling hands. She opened it and saw gold coins gleaming inside, more money than she had ever imagined possessing. Her hands shook as she held it, as she tried to understand that this was real, that this was actually happening. "There is also this," Henry said, handing her a sealed document. "It is a letter of manumission, signed and notarized. It states that you have been freed by your owner. It is not entirely legal, technically. Celeste owns you, not me, and she has not signed anything. But it should be enough to protect you if you are questioned while traveling. And once you are out of Louisiana, once you cross into Mexico or reach the Free States, the legal complications will not matter." Rose looked at the letter, at the official seal and signatures that supposedly transformed her from property into a person with rights and autonomy. She looked at the gold coins that represented possibilities she had never been permitted to imagine. And she looked at her father, trying to understand why he was doing this now, after all this time, after so many failures. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this now?" Henry was silent for a long moment. "Because I saw you in that courtroom," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of years of guilt and shame. "I saw what I had done to you, what I had allowed to be done to you, and I realized that if I did not act then, if I let you be convicted and sent away, I would never be able to live with myself. I have made many mistakes, Rose. I have been weak and selfish and cowardly, but I can do this one thing. I can give you your freedom." "What about Madame?" Rose asked. "What will she do when she discovers what you have done?" "I do not know," Henry admitted. "She will be furious. She may leave me, may attempt to divorce me, may make my life miserable in ways I cannot even anticipate. But that is my concern, not yours. You will be gone, and you will be free. That is what matters." Rose looked at her father for a long moment, trying to reconcile this act of belated decency with the years of failure and cowardice that had preceded it. She thought about thanking him, about offering some words of forgiveness or reconciliation. But she found she could not. The damage was too great, the harm too profound to be erased by this single gesture, however significant. "Thank you," she said finally. It was acknowledgement, not forgiveness. Recognition that he was trying, in his inadequate way, to make amends, even if it was too late to undo the harm that had been done. Henry nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, wanted to embrace her or offer some final words of apology or advice. But the distance between them was too great, the years of abuse and neglect too substantial to bridge in a single conversation. "The Harpers will be here at dawn tomorrow," Henry said. "Be ready." Rose left the study and returned to the quarters. She told no one about the conversation, about the gold and the manumission letter hidden in her dress, about the plan that would supposedly lead to freedom. She simply packed her few belongings, the blue dress Judith had helped her put on the day she was presented to Celeste, a few other items of clothing, a small wooden box that had belonged to her mother and that she had managed to keep through all her travels. That night, lying on her pallet in the cabin she shared with the other house slaves, Rose allowed herself for the first time to imagine what freedom might mean. She thought about her mother, Dinah, still working at Belle Reve in Mississippi, and wondered if she would ever see her again. She thought about the North, about places where slavery was illegal and black people could live without being considered property. She thought about having control over her own life, making her own choices, working for wages that belonged to her rather than to someone who owned her. It seemed impossible. She had lived her entire life as a slave, had never known any other existence. The idea that she could simply leave, could walk away from Bellamont House and everything it represented, felt like a fantasy that would dissolve when confronted with reality. But she held onto the leather pouch with its gold coins, held onto the letter that supposedly made her a free person, and she allowed herself to hope. The Harpers arrived at dawn as Henry had promised. They were a middle-aged couple, quiet and serious, who conducted their business with Henry quickly and efficiently. The bill of sale was signed and witnessed, money was exchanged for the sake of appearances, and Rose was helped into their wagon along with supplies for the journey. The transaction appeared entirely ordinary, just another sale of enslaved property, the kind that occurred thousands of times each day across the South. As the wagon pulled away from Bellamont House, Rose looked back one last time. She saw Henry standing on the gallery, watching her departure. Their eyes met across the distance, father and daughter, master and freed slave, two people connected by blood and separated by everything that blood had meant in the world they were leaving behind. Rose raised her hand in a small gesture, not quite a wave, not quite a farewell, but an acknowledgement. Henry raised his hand in return. Then the wagon turned onto the road, and Bellamont House disappeared from view. The journey to Texas took 2 weeks. The Harpers treated Rose with a kindness that felt strange and unfamiliar after years of systematic cruelty. They addressed her with respect, included her in decisions about when to stop and rest, shared their food without making her feel she was receiving charity. They explained their involvement in the network of abolitionists who helped enslaved people escape to freedom, the risks they took, the satisfaction they found in undermining an institution they considered morally abhorrent. Rose listened to all of this with a sense of unreality that persisted throughout the journey. She kept expecting something to go wrong, for slave catchers to appear, for the Harpers to reveal themselves as frauds, for some complication that would return her to bondage. But nothing went wrong. The journey proceeded without incident, and they reached the Harper Ranch near the Texas-Mexico border in late August. The Harpers gave Rose a room in their small house, fed her, allowed her to rest and recover from the journey. After a few days, they helped her cross the border into Mexico. It was easier than Rose had imagined. The border was not heavily patrolled in this remote area, and the Harpers had contacts on both sides who facilitated the crossing. Rose found herself standing on Mexican soil, technically beyond the reach of American slave law, officially a free person. The Harpers had arranged for Rose to stay with a family in a small town in northern Mexico, people who had helped other escaped slaves establish themselves in freedom. The family, a husband and wife with 3 children, took Rose in, helped her find work as a seamstress, taught her basic Spanish, gave her time to adjust to the overwhelming fact of her new status. Rose spent a year in that small Mexican town, working and saving money, trying to understand what it meant to be free. She discovered that freedom was not simply the absence of slavery, but the presence of choices about where to live, what work to do, how to spend her time, who to associate with. These were choices she had never been permitted to make before, and learning to make them was both exhilarating and terrifying. In 1853, Rose decided to continue north, to cross back into the United States, but into the free states where slavery was illegal. The decision was not without risk. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that escaped slaves could be captured even in free states and returned to their owners. But Rose had her letter of manumission, and she had a growing sense that she needed to be among other formerly enslaved people, people who understood what she had survived, people who were building lives in freedom despite all the obstacles placed in their path. The journey north took months. Rose traveled with a group of other escaped slaves, following the routes and safe houses of the Underground Railroad. She worked her way through Texas, through Indian Territory, through Kansas and Missouri, seeing the vast spaces of America that she had only heard about before. She encountered kindness and cruelty, met people who helped escaped slaves at great risk to themselves, and people who would happily turn in fugitives for the reward money. She reached Illinois in the spring of 1854, nearly 2 years after leaving Bellamont House. She settled in a small town with a community of free black people and formerly enslaved individuals who had made similar journeys. She used the remaining gold coins from Henry's payment to purchase a small piece of land and set up a dressmaking business, using the skills her mother had taught her all those years ago at Belle Reve. Over the next years, Rose built a life. She married a man named James, a former slave from Kentucky who had escaped to freedom 5 years before they met. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. Rose taught her daughters to read and write, skills that had been illegal for her to learn as a slave, but which she insisted her children would have. She taught them to sew, passing on the craft her mother had given her. And she taught them to be proud, to hold their heads high, to never accept that they were less than anyone else. Rose never returned to Louisiana. She never spoke of Henry Lavel or Celeste or Bellamont House to her children. When they asked about her past, she would say only that she had been born in Mississippi and had come north as a young woman. The details, she said, were not important. What mattered was the life she had built, the freedom she had claimed, the future she had secured for her descendants. But she kept the leather pouch that Henry had given her even after the gold was spent. And she kept the letter of manumission carefully preserved in a wooden box. She never showed these things to anyone, not her husband, not her children. But she kept them, perhaps as a reminder of where she had come from, or perhaps as evidence that her freedom had been earned, not simply given. Rose lived until 1903, dying at the age of 68, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She had witnessed the Civil War that finally ended slavery across the United States. She had seen Reconstruction and its eventual failure, seen the rise of Jim Crow laws that re-established white supremacy through legal means rather than direct ownership. She had seen her children grow up free, but still constrained, still fighting for full equality in a society that grudgingly acknowledged their humanity while denying them full citizenship. At her funeral, her eldest daughter spoke about Rose's strength, her resilience, her determination to build a better life for her family. But the daughter did not speak about Rose's past because she did not know it. The story of Bellamont House, of Henry and Celeste Lavel, of the 7 years Rose had spent as a slave in her father's household, all of that remained buried, a secret Rose had taken to her grave. The aftermath at Bellamont House was as Henry had anticipated. Celeste emerged from her chambers 3 days after Rose's departure, her face composed but her eyes cold with a fury that would never entirely dissipate. She and Henry continued to live in the same house but led entirely separate lives. They took meals separately, maintained different social circles, spoke only when absolutely necessary to manage household affairs. Celeste threw herself into social activities in New Orleans, maintaining her position through sheer force of will and careful attention to propriety. But she was a changed woman, harder and colder than before. Henry's health declined rapidly after 1852. Whether from guilt, stress, or simply the weight of his accumulated failures, he aged dramatically over the next few years. He continued to manage his business affairs, but his heart was no longer in it. He drank more, slept less, spent long hours in his study staring at nothing. The other planters noticed the change, whispered about what had happened in the courthouse, speculated about the real reason Henry had contradicted his wife's testimony. But no one knew the full story, and Henry never spoke of it. Henry Lavel died in the spring of 1856 at the age of 51. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, which was more accurate than the doctor knew. He was buried in New Orleans with a funeral attended by Louisiana society. Celeste stood at the graveside in black silk, accepting condolences with grace and dignity, showing no emotion. Celeste inherited everything: the plantation, the slaves, the investments. She managed it all with cold efficiency, but she grew increasingly reclusive after Henry's death. The social position she had guarded so carefully seemed to matter less. She was seen less frequently in New Orleans, spent more time alone at Bellamont House. The Civil War came in 1861. Confederate bonds and currency became worthless when the South lost. The slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, and most left immediately. Judith, the elderly woman who had tried to warn Rose years earlier, went to New Orleans and lived there until her death in 1870, working as a paid seamstress and never speaking of her years at Bellamont House. Celeste struggled to maintain the plantation after the war, but it was impossible. Without enslaved labor, without capital, without the structures that had supported the plantation system, Bellamont House fell into decline. The fields went unplanted, the buildings deteriorated, and Celeste became more isolated. She was sometimes seen walking through empty rooms, talking to herself in French, arguing with ghosts. Celeste Dufresne-Laval died in 1871 at the age of 62. She was found in her bedroom, sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at overgrown gardens. She had been dead for several days before anyone discovered her. She left no heirs, no will, no instructions for her estate. Bellamont House was sold for debts and eventually fell into ruin. By the early 20th century, Bellamont House was nothing but crumbling foundations and a few standing walls, another forgotten monument to the plantation's south and all its moral failures. The truth of what had happened there remained buried for generations. It was only in 1978 that a historian named Patricia Williams, researching plantation records in Louisiana archives, came across the bill of sale for a 12-year-old girl named Rose, purchased by Henry Laval in 1847. Something about the dates and prices seemed odd. Williams began investigating, tracking down other documents, trial records from 1852, letters between Celeste and correspondence in Mississippi business records from the Mercier plantation. Eventually, through genealogical research, Williams made contact with Rose's great-granddaughter, a woman named Elena who lived in Illinois. Elena had inherited a wooden box that had belonged to Rose. Inside were the leather pouch, now empty, the letter of manumission signed by Henry Laval, and a small notebook written in Rose's hand containing a brief account of her life. Williams published her findings in a scholarly journal. The story of Rose and the Lavals became part of the historical record, taught in universities, discussed in books about slavery. But for Rose's descendants, it was more than history. It was their family story, their heritage. Elena and her siblings traveled to Louisiana to see what remained of Bellamont House. They stood among the ruins, among crumbling foundations and overgrown gardens, trying to imagine what their ancestor had endured there. She survived, Elena said, standing where the main house had once been. That is what matters. She survived and she built a life and she made sure her children had better. That is her legacy. And it was. Rose's legacy was not the suffering she had endured, but the strength she had shown, the life she had built, the freedom she had claimed and passed on to her descendants. Her story stood as evidence that even in circumstances designed to destroy human dignity, people could resist, could survive, could build lives of meaning despite all obstacles placed in their path. The ruins of Bellamont House offered no answers, no resolution, no justice for what had occurred there. They simply stood as silent testimony to a system that had corrupted every relationship it touched, that had made cruelty ordinary and suffering routine, that had treated human beings as property to be bought and sold, and used without regard for their humanity. Rose's story was one story among millions, one account of survival in a system that lasted for centuries and damaged everyone it touched, enslaved people most directly, but also the enslavers who built their wealth and status on the suffering of others, who compromised their own humanity by denying the humanity of those they owned. The historical record provided no moral comfort, no satisfying resolution. Henry Laval had freed his daughter, but only after years of cowardice and neglect. Celeste Laval had pursued revenge against a child for sins the child had not committed. Rose had survived and built a life, but only after enduring years of trauma that could never be fully healed or forgotten. The facts stood in the archives and the historical journals, documented and verified, another chapter in the long accounting of American slavery and its aftermath. The ruins of Bellamont House gradually disappeared as nature reclaimed the land, until nothing remained except the records in distant archives and the memories preserved by Rose's descendants, testimony to what had happened, witness to suffering that no passage of time could entirely erase or redeem.